Long before the world heard the sound of war, the real turning point had already happened. Quiet, unseen, and unstoppable. History rarely begins with violence. It often unfolds in subtle ways. A policy decided in a distant office, a trade route redirected, a local leader replaced. These small shifts, accumulating over decades, shape the destiny of nations long before anyone notices. In Burkina Faso, the roots of its eventual decision to demand France's withdrawal were planted generations earlier, in the complex legacies of colonialism and the lingering influence of foreign powers. Burkina Faso, then known as Upper Volta, was once a French colony. To the colonizers, it was not a nation of people, but a territory to manage. Villages were mapped, populations catalogued, and taxes structured to fund the empire. Trade policies and infrastructure projects primarily served France, while local communities were left to navigate their own survival. Even after independence in 1960, France retained influence through military support, economic aid, and political guidance. Decisions that seemed local were often shaped by external priorities. The country was free in name but constrained in reality. Generations grew up under this invisible shadow. Farmers noticed rules favoring foreign trade. Students learned curricula shaped by distant powers. Citizens recognized that real control often lay elsewhere. Even local leaders navigated a delicate balance between pleasing their people and appeasing foreign interests. Over decades, this created subtle frustration. Independence existed, but sovereignty remained partial. Neo-colonial influence had become normalized, almost invisible, but it was deeply felt in daily life. By the late 20th century, a new generation began questioning these arrangements more openly. Scholars, activists, and journalists debated autonomy and self-determination. Citizens asked, who truly benefits from our resources and policies? Can we call ourselves fully independent if leaders answer to outsiders? These conversations spread quietly, from homes to universities to civic spaces, and gradually sowed the seeds of change. Culture played a key role in shaping awareness. Music, literature, and art celebrated independence, resilience, and pride in heritage. Stories of resistance, anti-colonial struggle, and local heroes resurfaced, reminding people that sovereignty is earned, not given. Education helped reclaim history and inspire national pride, while simultaneously highlighting that foreign influence still shaped many aspects of life. Young citizens and leaders began realizing that true autonomy would not arrive by waiting. It had to be demanded. Economic challenges and political instability further fueled this awareness. Citizens witnessed successes and failures alike and began suspecting that foreign powers had interests in both. The tension between perceived independence and actual autonomy became a central part of national life. People quietly learned that change would require patience, strategy, and resilience. Generational memory, combined with cultural pride and growing social awareness, created the conditions for a historic shift. By the early 21st century, these pressures converged. Citizens had absorbed lessons from history, the importance of vigilance, self-determination, and asserting control over their nation's destiny. They understood that sovereignty is not a gift, it is a right to be claimed. When modern crises arose, insecurity, ineffective leadership, and generational shifts, the population was prepared. The eventual demand for France's withdrawal was not spontaneous. It was the inevitable result of decades of reflection, observation, and preparation. This story demonstrates that dramatic events rarely happen in isolation. Wars, political upheavals, and major historical shifts are often the result of long-term forces: cultural memory, economic dependence, social awareness, and resilience. In Burkina Faso, the people's stand for sovereignty was the product of generations quietly observing, learning and preparing for the day when they would reclaim control over their own destiny. Real change rarely arrives with noise. It gathers slowly, quietly, like pressure building beneath the earth before an earthquake. By the late 1960s and into the 1970s, something had begun to shift across Burkina Faso. It was not loud enough to be called rebellion, not visible enough to be called revolution, but it was unmistakable to those paying attention. People were thinking differently. Independence had promised dignity, control, and a future shaped from within. Yet daily life revealed a more complicated reality. Economic decisions still seemed guided from afar. Military cooperation often carried conditions. Political leadership appeared stable, but stability did not always mean transformation. Farmers worked land that produced value, yet communities changed slowly. Urban workers saw development projects rise, but opportunity remained limited. Students learned the language of national pride, while quietly questioning why real power still felt distant. This period was not driven by anger. It was driven by awareness. Awareness spreads quietly through observation rather than announcement. Teachers encouraged students to think critically. Traders in markets discussed rising costs and how decisions affecting their livelihoods came from far away. Musicians performed songs of pride, yet their lyrics carried subtle reflection on unfinished freedom. Across towns and villages, a generation was learning to compare promise with reality. And once comparisons begin, expectations follow. If independence meant self-rule, why did economic systems remain constrained? If sovereignty had been achieved, why did national direction still feel negotiated rather than fully chosen? If the nation was free, why did progress feel cautious and incomplete? These questions were rarely shouted. They were spoken quietly, shared among trusted friends, discussed in careful circles. But quiet questions are powerful. Once people recognize patterns, they begin to see them everywhere. Political stability proved difficult to maintain. Leadership shifted repeatedly, each transition bringing promises of reform. Yet frequent change produced uncertainty rather than confidence. Plans were introduced, but implementation moved slowly. Policies aimed to modernize, but results remained uneven. Citizens watched carefully, listened, and remembered. Trust, once freely given after independence, became cautious. Confidence was no longer automatic, it had to be earned. External pressures added complexity. International partnerships provided resources, training, and aid, but support often carried expectations. Cooperation offered opportunity, but sometimes limited flexibility. Balancing internal priorities with external relationships required compromise, and compromise rarely feels empowering to populations that expect full autonomy. The nation existed within a web of domestic ambition, global influence, and institutional limits. From the outside, order remained intact. Government offices functioned. Schools educated students. Public ceremonies celebrated national identity. But beneath the surface, expectations were rising steadily. For the younger generation, patience grew thin. They had grown up hearing stories of liberation and dignity. They believed they were living in a nation fully in control of its destiny. Yet their lived experience suggested something more complicated. A country free in principle, but still navigating invisible boundaries. Cultural expression reflected this tension. Writers explored identity and direction. Musicians celebrated resilience while hinting at unfinished journeys. Artists portrayed strength and reflection. Freedom was no longer only celebration, it was being examined. Daily life continued. Markets opened. Civil servants worked. Families commemorated national events. Stability seemed intact, but symbolic independence no longer satisfied. People wanted visible change, leadership capable of redefining possibility, and sovereignty that felt complete. Momentum was building slowly and steadily. The nation was no longer at rest. Pressure, once it reaches its limit, will always find release. Pressure does not release all at once. It tightens slowly year after year until a single moment makes everything visible. By the 2010s and early 2020s, the long-building tension inside Burkina Faso could no longer remain beneath the surface. What had once been quiet awareness became public frustration. What had once been cautious discussion became open demand. Security became the turning point. Armed insurgent violence spread across large parts of the country, especially in rural regions where protection was weakest. Communities faced fear, displacement, and uncertainty. Families left their homes. Local economies slowed. Everyday life became defined by risk. For many citizens, the most urgent question was no longer political theory or historical influence. It was survival. For years, international military cooperation had been presented as necessary for stability. Support from France was framed as partnership against extremism. But as insecurity grew rather than declined, public perception began to shift. If external support was meant to bring protection, why was violence expanding? If military cooperation was essential, why did safety feel increasingly distant? These questions spread quickly through cities, towns, and villages. Demonstrations began to appear in public spaces. Protesters gathered with signs, voices, and visible anger. Some demanded accountability from national leaders. Others questioned the entire structure of foreign military presence. The issue was no longer abstract sovereignty, it was practical results. People judged outcomes, and the outcomes did not feel reassuring. Political instability intensified the moment. Leadership changes occurred rapidly, reflecting deep dissatisfaction inside both government institutions and the wider population. Each transition promised reform. Each shift raised expectations. But expectations had changed. Citizens were no longer asking for gradual adjustment. They were demanding decisive control over national direction. Public sentiment moved beyond frustration into determination. Demonstrations became larger. National conversations became sharper. Media coverage amplified voices that had once remained quiet. The language of partnership was increasingly replaced by the language of independence, security, and dignity. For many, the continued presence of foreign troops no longer symbolized support. It symbolized unfinished autonomy. Regional and global attention followed closely. Neighboring governments watched carefully. International organizations such as Economic Community of West African States expressed concern about stability and political transitions. Diplomatic discussions intensified, but inside the country, public opinion was already moving faster than diplomacy. Eventually, the decision came. Authorities announced the end of formal military arrangements that had defined relations for years. Foreign forces were instructed to withdraw. What had once seemed permanent was suddenly temporary. What had once been unquestioned was now reversed. For supporters of the decision, this moment represented restoration, a reclaiming of full authority over national security and political direction. For critics, it carried uncertainty about what would follow. But regardless of perspective, the meaning was clear. A long historical relationship had reached a turning point that could not easily be undone. Crowds gathered again, but the atmosphere had changed. The demonstrations that once demanded change now witnessed it. Flags waved, voices rose. Some expressed relief, others expressed cautious hope. But nearly everyone recognized the significance of what had happened. This was not a sudden rupture. It was the visible release of pressure that had built across decades through policy, influence, expectation, and lived experience. The moment the world noticed was only the final stage. The real transformation had begun long before, quietly shaping how a nation understood power, partnership, and self-determination. History rarely moves in a straight line, but sometimes, after years of slow accumulation, it turns sharply. And when it does, the change feels inevitable, as if it had been waiting all along for the moment it could finally emerge.